this point, I would also like to point out there is a long 3-week workshop coming up at Hyderabad supported by International Brain Research Organization, IBRO-UNESCO workshop on computational and theoretical neuroscience. Of course, unfortunately the day is past, but there are events happening, and I think this is a very nice sign for Indian scientists. I work in Department of Computer and Information Sciences, and I also am associated with Center for Neural and Cognitive Sciences. Today I would like to, I guess, the tea break was good in some sense. Now we are moving on to behavioral, right? There's a different, this talk is in some sense related to sequencing motor actions and so on, but it's at a much higher level. We are studying the behavior of this so-called implicit sequence learning. I have organized my talk primarily the first part as a kind of a tutorial on what is this implicit learning and various paradigms, methods, and I'll briefly touch upon computational models, so it is it fits with the INCF framework. But these models have been very useful in understanding implicit learning. And then today I would particularly talk about the role of attention, what role attention plays in implicit learning, and share some of the results that my student who has done an MPhil thesis at our center, Anuj Shukla, the results from his thesis work on this theme. And at this point I would also like to acknowledge, before I start, the help from a hospital at Hyderabad, Nizam's Institute of Medical Sciences, allowing us to use their eye tracking facility. Although the study at this point was done only on normal subjects, normal participants. So what is implicit learning? Well, it has been quite hard to define, and I am quoting this from an old survey from Axel Clearmans, but the situation remains pretty much similar even at this point. Implicit learning is, what is written here is not a definition, but a way to understand this. It's incidental learning. Learning, you are processing stimuli, and there is something that happens within your system that's incidental, and the ability, broadly, ability to learn without awareness, or we call learning is implicit when we acquire new information without actually setting out to do so, without really intending to do so, and in such a way that the resulting knowledge is difficult to describe or express. That you possess the knowledge, but when I ask you, can you describe what you learned, it will not be able to describe or express. So to kind of summarize, this is the learning where we know more than we can tell or describe. Contrasting this with implicit learning to kind of make it make our idea of implicit learning more grounded. In explicit learning, in for example tasks like learning how to solve a problem or learning a concept, it is typically hypothesis driven and fully conscious, as opposed to what happens in implicit learning. And there are abundant examples in real life of learning implicitly. Two of them I put down for their importance. Language acquisition and use involves a large part of language acquisition and use involves implicit learning. And in general, skill learning has this: you learn how to ride a bicycle, and I ask you now, give me a description of what happens, right? So you cannot give me how you are able to ride a bicycle, right? So you have, but you can demonstrate it. So there are going on to distinguish from other areas of study, particularly subliminal perception research, where there has been a lot of work on priming and priming by subliminal stimuli. In implicit learning, typically the stimuli are supraliminal as opposed to the subliminal perception research. And similarly, implicit memory research, there is a large body of work on memory being implicit aspects of memory. So unlike that, what characterizes and distinguishes implicit learning is that this learning is sensitive to structural relationship between stimulus items, not as much to specific stimuli themselves. So what follows what, the relationship is what is emphasized. Now there are three major paradigms in implicit learning, common paradigms for studying, investigating implicit learning: artificial grammar learning, dynamic control task, and sequence learning. I'll give you a brief idea what these are. Back in 60s, Reber proposed this artificial grammar learning. On the right hand side you see finite state grammar, where the way to understand this, there is an input. This machine generates strings of letters starting from the in state and ending at the out state, and it generates following these arcs, and every time it transits, and these circles are called states of this system. This is in other language, this is called finite state automaton, where you go from state to state and generate the symbol that is resident on the arc. So for example, you visit this particular path, you generate T, P, right? So T, and if you stay in this state, you can generate P, then transit from here to here, T, T, P, T, S, and that is a valid sequence from this. So this generates a huge number of sequences. The idea is that this particular schema is behind sequences. From this one can generate sequences that follow this particular schema, and also generate sequences that do not subscribe or conform to this particular grammar, right? So this setting, people are asked to memorize. You generate some sample sequences, and I have a better view of this in the next slide, where you, from this finite state grammar, you generate sequences, and there have been variety of paradigms. In one of them, for example, you can use this sequence to, so in this case, if you see, there are 5 symbols, T, S, X, P, and K, right? So there are 5 locations corresponding to each of these letters. Generate the sequence, and what the subjects see is a stimulus that appears at one of these 5 locations per trial, and all they have to do is press the corresponding button corresponding to that stimulus location. And as they do this, they practice the sequence that's basically coming out of this. And there are grammatical sequences. They do many trials of this, and there's implicit learning that ensures, and there is a test trial where you are given a grammatical string, you are given a string, you don't know whether it follows. We tell the subjects that after they go through this, they are asked to memorize a set of training strings, then they are informed that there is a grammar that generated these strings. Now can you, given new strings, can you classify them into what they think follows what they have seen or does not follow? Basically a judgment of grammaticality and ungrammaticality. And so these are examples of strings that follow grammar, and those that are generated by switching at least one or several letters from the valid strings. So it has been observed in this paradigm, for example, people are not able to articulate what they have learned, but their performance on this grammaticality judgment is way above chance level, indicating something that they have acquired, but implicitly that they cannot describe. So this is one very popular paradigm. The other paradigm is dynamic control task. Again, an old one, 1980s. Berry and Broadbent proposed this, where subjects interact with a simulated system. Example, in this case, they are controlling a sugar factory production. And what they have to do is, on each trial, subjects can hire or fire workers to maintain certain level of sugar production. So in this panel, you need to enter next level of workforce to maintain the production level of say 9,000 or whatever. The current output is 8,000, but the target is 9,000, and they need to adjust something within the system to maintain this. And it has been observed that subjects are pretty good at maintaining, although the underlying behavior is governed by an equation that is unknown to the subjects. They can pretty much guess, but they cannot articulate at the end of the task, but they can they show behavior which mimics this equation that governs this relationship between the number of the production and the number of workforce, for example. So these are called dynamic control tasks. There is one paradigm again used for studying implicit learning. The other very popular paradigm which studies sequence learning is introduced by Nissen and Bullemer back in 1980s, late 80s. This is popularly known as serial reaction time task. And let us see what happens in this. In this task, participants respond. There is a display on which the stimulus appears. Just as I have shown in the artificial grammar, there is a display where there is in this case, one of the 4 locations is highlighted by an asterisk. Subjects simply have to press the corresponding button on the keypad, and these the sequence of stimuli appear, and unknown to the participants there is an underlying pattern that these series of asterisks follow. It's not known or given to them, but by responding sequentially to the stimuli, subjects become experienced in this unknown sequence. And there are 2 groups in the original study. There is a group that is given random sequence of stimuli, that they do not show any improvement in the reaction time to average reaction time stays pretty much fixed for stimuli over number of blocks. The other group that is exposed to this repeating sequence, their response time increases, indicating they are learning something predictive about how stimuli follow one another. And at the end of this, when you debrief, when you ask the subjects, can you, for example, generate or give, and I'll talk about methods of eliciting or understanding what knowledge has been acquired by subjects. So when you debrief the subjects deny any knowledge of any repeating pattern, right? So that's the hallmark of implicit learning. Okay, so this is another view of that. Typically what is done is you give 12 trials of training trials where the sequence stays constant. The response time shows an improvement. This indicating something is being learned. There are learning predictions. And in the 13th block, typically you change the sequence to another unknown or unseen one, untrained one, and the reaction time goes up. And when you introduce the sequence again, it comes back to the level where they were before. So this is typically, and the effect size in this case is the amount of the reaction time difference between the blocks that are adjacent to this, before and after. What is the average reaction time here versus this? This difference is kind of an index of how much learning happened within this. So again, the typical behavior here is that subjects deny knowing that the stimuli followed a particular sequence or any sequence. Okay, so the other issue within this implicit learning literature is how do we establish knowledge, some knowledge acquired and that resides implicitly. There are 3 major ways of doing this within the literature: verbal reports from the subjects, forced choice tests, these are more objective, and subjective tests. In the free report, this paradigm introduced by Matthews, you have two groups of subjects. One, original subjects called original. They are exposed to grammatical strings. Remember that AGL paradigm, artificial grammar learning paradigm. Training phase, then they classified new strings in the test phase. After every 10 classification decisions, they were asked, can you give some instructions of how you are classifying? Right? So they give some things, T should follow R or whatever, and use those instructions, give those instructions to so-called yoked subjects that follow these instructions, and they classify the same stimuli. And it appears the original subjects were always about 30% better than yoked subjects. Meaning that whatever knowledge they are expressing is not reliable enough for the yoked subjects to classify test strings, but their performance itself is superior. So they are using knowledge that they do not have access to in some sense. This is one way to test. This is the free report version of elicitation of the knowledge. The forced choice tests, which are the tests of choice in most of SRT tasks, force the subject to respond regardless of confidence and make sure that there are appropriate cues present so that the test is sensitive to this knowledge that they've acquired. So for example, after training on grammatical strings, participants are asked to classify new strings. After each classification, subjects underline the part of the string that makes it ungrammatical. For example, if this is the string and TR is what is ungrammatical, they outline that this is what makes it ungrammatical. For example, TR cannot occur starting in the second location. If that's what so this is more objective, and there are several methods of doing this objective way. And the other one, which I will not discuss too much, but subjective measures, where the basic idea is the issue that we need to keep in mind, absence of discrimination performance is good evidence for absence of conscious knowledge, but presence of the discrimination performance is not good enough for conscious knowledge being acquired. So you need a measure in this subjective measure, you need a measure that is tuned to conscious knowledge rather than any kind of knowledge, right? So subjective measures are one other way. Now moving on, we discussed so far various paradigms, various methods of eliciting. Now what are the mechanisms that perhaps that underlie this type of implicit learning? Taking artificial grammar learning as a paradigm for implicit learning. So these are sequences, ignore all these boxes, but these are various grammatical strings generated from the finite state grammar. There are broadly four mechanisms that are proposed from a computational perspective. The first one is rule abstraction approach. Basically, given these strings, you have a learning algorithm that picks up regularities, rules within this. So some sort of a symbolic knowledge is generated from in the form of production rules or discrimination trees or a classifier. So for example, in this, your rule learning algorithm can pick up, if the string begins with T or P, then it is a grammatical string. So that kind of rule could be extracted. So people said this is perhaps what underlies implicit learning, although it is not this rule knowledge is not accessible to the subjects, but that's what is acquired implicitly. The second major approach is fragment-based and chunking approaches. These exploit redundancies in the training material, right? So they look at what is a chunk that repeats in many of these sequences in the training example. So VPX is a pattern that occurs in several of these strings, and this kind of fragment-based approach picks up database of such subsequences that underlie grammatical sequences, and use this to classify the new strings that come. Right, so this is one paradigm. The other is exemplar based approach, where the whole instances are memorized during training and new exemplars are classified. You have some sort of a similarity metric that directly compares these strings and gives a score of how likely it is going to be a grammatical string based on this example database. The final one, most powerful approach and lot of work in this area, is distributional and statistical approaches, including neural network models. What they develop some sort of a model of the underlying statistical constraints present in the sequence of letters. So using associative learning mechanisms, one example is Elman's simple recurrent network. This is used for mimicking AGL type of string learning. So in this approach, current element, Elman's simple recurrent network is a 3-layered backpropagation type of learning method, where you have input layer, hidden layer and output layer, and hidden layer has this kind of a one-to-one copy of the previous activations are kept in a context layer, and this combines with the next input, and as you can see, as time goes on, the temporal window in which this context looks at increases. And as it learns, this temporal window looks at the relationship between successive items. So after learning what this network is able to do, given the current element, it has a prediction what follows next. And the knowledge within this network is implicit in the sense of it being distributed over the weights of the network. Although this is a supervised learning approach, there are other methods proposed in the literature which work on unsupervised or self-organizing type of approaches. For example, people used autoencoder type of networks to learn these grammatical strings. Okay, so so far we looked at different aspects of implicit learning. Today what I would like to focus on is the role of attention in implicit learning. And this is very important, because what we have been saying is that implicit learning happens automatically, it doesn't require attentional resources. Right? So if it is automatic and it engages some independent system, it should be possible to obtain learning even in conditions where attention is engaged, for example, in a secondary task. So I load the system with basically put the subject in a dual task paradigm, where they are following the stimuli in the SRT, but they are also doing an additional task which engages the attentional system. And typically the secondary task requires subjects to keep running count of, for example, tones being presented, ask you give a cumulative count of tones of certain frequency, high frequency or low frequency, right? So the idea is that if it is really, it does not engage attentional resources, you should have pretty much no impairment in sequence learning. Now the current literature is very equivocal about the role of attention. Overall, what the position people have taken is IL is, implicit learning is relatively robust in the face of distraction. Many studies that point out this, IL perhaps processes possibly occur in parallel with additional processes that are more dependent on the availability of attention, intention and so on, right? So this is the view, but recent finding of Shanks and Shannon, it claims that attentional demands really, they have shown in a task that it impairs implicit learning. So still there is some inconclusive nature of the role played by attention in implicit learning. What we decided to do is two things. One, look at this implicit learning in oculomotor system and also probe the role of attention. So oculomotor, I'll skip this, the result of Shannon, but I'll come back to if there is a basic thing that they have shown is, you remember now, by now you are familiar with this kind of a graph where you have blocks, the up to 11 blocks of training and 12 test, 13, 14 they come back. And in dual or single repeating sequence paradigm, you get the classic SRT effect. But when you load up the system with a dual task, whether the sequence repeats or whether sequence follows some sort of probabilistic, it's not a fixed sequence, but it follows same probabilities that the original. In both conditions, the effect, if you introduce a new sequence, there is no, so subjects do not show this kind of a rebound increase in the RT, right? So oculomotor SRT, there is relatively less work in this. Basically you ask subjects to move their eye, so the saccadic system is doing implicit learning, and look at if you get similar effects. One study in 2007 basically follows the classic paradigm, except now in this the stimulus and the response are directed to the same location, right? So this mapping is maximally compatible, whereas in the other case manual paradigms typically you have display, visual stimulation, and then the motor response is on another response system. So we used, or in this paradigm, Kinder 2007, they have given a sequence that follows this location. These numbers are, I guess, numbered 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4 like this, and what is shown is a sequence of 12 locations where subjects make a saccade to that location. Now what they have shown in the study that oculomotor system also exhibits SRT, right? So this implicit learning and the classic SRT effect is observed. However, what we saw is that there are some methodological issues with this study, so we wanted to address those and then use this paradigm to study the role of attention. So do we, for example, see attention impairs oculomotor implicit learning or not? But before doing that, there are a couple of issues that we had to address. That in their study there was no control group that is exposed to, for example, a random sequence, and then the other was they used a tone because you don't have control on eye movements and you have the stimulus, you have to direct your attention there, and there is an infrared camera that is tracking your eye location. So you don't know whether you have fixated your saccade, landed on the stimulus location or not. So in order to give a feedback, what they have done is, if it doesn't land in an area near the stimulus location, they give a beep, and then the subject has to make a corrective saccade. Now this kind of intervention in a task like this can have really an impact on implicit learning. Anything you do within the task can have an impact on implicit processes. So what we did is remove that. We have what is called an area of interest around this. As soon as the saccade lands in that area of interest, the display shifts to the next stimulus and they have to make a next saccade. So this saccade sequence is what we recorded. This is an example. So this is the actual recording. Subject only sees the black dot, that the other colored dot is for our purpose, right? So they don't get any feedback, and sometimes the sucker doesn't land. And in our case, what we said is that this stimulus doesn't move to the next location unless it registers the saccade in that. So it stays on, it's a cue to the subject, they have to make a corrective saccade. So we eliminated this tone as a way of feedback, and that gave actually a much bigger effect. I don't show the comparative, so this is the eye tracking system that we used from the Nizam's Institute, and similarly arranged in this diamond shape, and we took the same sequences, and there's a familiarization phase, training phase, and then the recall phase, which is where we take a combination of free verbal report and objective type of measure, right? So we looked at this, and the results show that so these are the two groups. In experiment 1, we had one group that sees fixed sequence, the other group that sees random sequence of locations, and they do not show any sort of the average reaction time stays around 310 milliseconds, and then you see this classic effect when you move from the training sequence to the new test sequence. You see an increase in the reaction time, and it comes back when you introduce the original sequence. So, when we do the debrief using a questionnaire, what we show is subjects are unaware of a repeating sequence, and this particular paradigm is very good, unlike the visual one. It's very fast, 100 millisecond, and the implicit learning can be very effective because it is so fast, it goes so fast, there is no really danger that they can actually guess what's happening. And in the second experiment, we introduced tone counting task additional to this, and what we see, our results is that this is the group that's doing tone counting. This is no tone. Of course, there is a price being paid for doing two tasks together, but what you see is a robust SRT effect. Even with tone counting, they show sensitivity. When you introduce a new sequence, there is an increase in RT, right? Indicating that they have realized it is not the same sequence, right? So there is no predictive. I mean, they are as predictive in the dual task as in the case of the single task, right? So these are all some details of those results. And we also calculate what is called a D score, which is the difference in the reaction times between the test block and the average of the two blocks that pre and post that are located pre and post the test block. And you see that although we see a slight difference, but it's not statistically significant between the two groups, the difference is large between when they are doing a new sequence versus when they are exposed to the training sequence, indicating again there is knowledge that is acquired implicitly. So our conclusion, implicit learning unaffected by attentional demands in the oculomotor SRT. And this is just one more thing just to show that the difference between the actual count and the count generated by the subject is close to, where the difference is very minimal. So meaning that they are doing the second task also equally well, and they are not just ignoring the tone counting. Okay, to summarize, experiment 1 establishes, in our opinion, methodologically more robust way of showing oculomotor system also undergoes implicit learning. Not very surprising, but just that I think this kind of paradigm is very powerful. And second is that this is so our result adds weight to this camp that says attention really does not attentional demands do not impair implicit learning. So you have these two positions, and the current results point to perhaps a parallel independent system that engages when you are experiencing series of stimuli and acquiring internally some relationship among the stimuli. So in conclusion, what I have done today is to show you that a given tutorial overview of what is this implicit learning research. Implicit learning is fundamental and ubiquitous process in cognition, and from information processing perspective, it's best characterized as a kind of complex form of priming, such that distributional knowledge acquired through incidental experience with the series of stimuli can influence processing or performance in the absence of explicit awareness. There are a couple of open questions that we are interested, perhaps port this to EEG and if possible to functional MRI to study separate brain systems. There is again a lot of work in this area, but not much focused in oculomotor paradigm. And the other issue which is of interest to us is the role of implicit learning in cognitive development. The ability to sequence stimuli is fundamental to many cognitive capacities that develop over during the developmental stages, including language acquisition. All of these have highly stylized sequential behavior. So tracking this over the developmental profile, seeing, particularly in children that exhibit variety of developmental disorders, learning disorders, and some other developmental disorders, this could be an index of, this is like stimulus, domain independent, a domain general index of sequencing ability, and see if it correlates with some of the issues that the children are facing, right, within development. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Dr. Questions?
So it's very interesting that attentional demands don't interfere with implicit learning. And I thought maybe this system could be productively used to try and figure out what kind of neurotransmitter systems might modulate implicit learning. For example, can you do these tasks in the presence of drugs like caffeine, which is thought maybe to enhance learning, or nicotine, or narcotics?
Right.
To see things that would affect kind of awareness, but may not affect or maybe enhance implicit learning.
A very good suggestion. I've actually totally not covered anything about neural correlates or what. Partly I'm not aware of that part of the literature. I'll take this suggestion. Very nice way to manipulate this aspect and see what happens to the implicit process.
Give one group lots of coffee.
Huh?
Give one group lots of coffee and control.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, just that. I was just wondering if it's worth measuring the the pupil diameter along with the whole. There's a correlate of attention.
Correlate of?
Of attention, at least the locus coeruleus kind of. So you could actually, while you're doing the tracking, you could actually measure the size of the pupil diameter, right, on your.
Right. Okay.
Just see that variation, or it's independent.
Right. Thank you.
Multitasking is something that many people anyway do most of the time. But within that, if learning is happening while the other tasks are anyway being conducted, so I think are you referring to subcortical or cortical processes? If you say that there are two separate or parallel circuits, neural circuits engaged in this. Where
Yes.
I think child sort of starts with implicit learning, and then in the school they are made explicit learning, and people sometimes criticize that. So please convey your thoughts on that.
Right. Yeah, there's actually a nice review paper that I have not really put by Tim Curran in 2007, I think, where he tried to look at the current literature on the neural correlates of implicit learning. So one of the points that comes out is basal ganglia, for example, is very much involved in implicit learning. In that sense, this talk really goes with the rest of the talks that this morning. But cortical circuits are involved more in explicit, and there is also some debate about the role of hippocampus versus basal ganglia in this, right? So I am not completely aware of that area of work, but yeah, the next thing that I put up open areas is brain systems involved in this.
Okay, if there are no further questions, thank you very much, Babu Raju. And